watching us online in various capacities. I'm Barbara Rimkunis, Co-Executive Director of the Exeter Historical Society. Tonight's program takes place in Misquamscook, now called Exeter, in Nadakina, the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples past and present. We acknowledge with gratitude the Alnabak, the people, who have stewarded Nadakina and its Aki, Nibi, Olaquakak, and Owasak, the land, the waterways, the flora, and the fauna throughout the generations. And now a message from the 250th Commission. By 1776, the rising sentiment for independence in New Hampshire had found its center in the revolutionary capital of Exeter. It was here that the first state constitution was drafted, and here that the Declaration of Independence was first read. It was from here that the call went forth that the time had come to fight for a free America. In the decades since the Revolution, Exeter has been home to endless stories that embody the large and complicated story of the United States. These stories highlight the courage, the strength, and the resilience of our forebears and our neighbors. The Exeter 250 Commission invites all of the broader Exeter community to share in the celebration of our shared independence and the celebration of those stories, the familiar and the untold alike. Join us in 2026 for our declaration, our town, our stories. You can support the 250 Commission by going online and checking out the website, by buying one of these lovely, highly collectible pins. They are available at the Exeter Historical Society, the public library, and also at the Trends gift shop, and you can also get it up at the rec department. Now I'll turn it over to Laura.
Thank you, Barbara. My name is Laura Martin, and I am the other co-executive director of the Exeter Historical Society. Thank you for joining us at the Exeter Town Hall, or on Zoom, or Channel 6, or YouTube, to learn about the daily lives of Exeter women throughout the ages. I'd like to thank Exeter TV for bringing all of our programs to our members and friends virtually, for which we are always grateful. Next month's program will be on Tuesday, April 7th at the Town Hall, right here, at 7 p.m. Dave Soms will present a program entitled The Boston and Maine Railroad Through Exeter, Mainline Transportation. We hope you can attend. We also hope that you enjoy barbecue and will join us this Thursday, March 5th, between 4 and 8 p.m. at Ornell's Barbecue in Kittery for a fundraiser. 20% of the proceeds of the night will benefit the Historical Society, so we thank Ornell's. Tonight, if you'd like to ask a question and you're here in person, please raise your hand and wait for one of us to come to you with a microphone. Not only will it help our speaker hear you, but it will allow those online to hear you as well. If you are on Zoom, please put your question in the comments section and we'll try to ask it on your behalf. And one more thing before we get to the main event. 166 years ago this very night, Abraham Lincoln stood on this stage and addressed an enthusiastic audience with a sprinkling of ladies. We are truly fortunate to be able to gather in this historic place every month to listen to a wonderful historical presentation. And now to introduce tonight's speaker. Caroline Siecke moved to Exeter in 2007 and joined the faculty at the Cooperative Middle School full-time the following year. Exerted by the Exeter Historical Society. She was recruited to the Board of Trustees by the late Molly Stevenson, who was a truly remarkable friend, educator, and trustee. Caroline is the liaison between the Historical Society and the SAU 16 schools, coordinating the annual youth night and other efforts to integrate local history into social studies education. One of her greatest accomplishments is raising a daughter who has turned out to be a history major in college. Thank you, Caroline.
When you're told you're following Abraham Lincoln, how do you follow an act like that? So, my interest in this subject was sparked many years ago because this was a particular favorite saying of my mother's and probably of a lot of women raising children and running a household and holding down a job. And when I proposed this topic, I imagined that I would be talking mostly about how women ran their households. However, our foremothers had other plans for me. As I started looking into what women were doing on a daily basis, what quickly became apparent is that women were engaged in activity that went well beyond taking care of hearth and home. And the more I dug into it, the story that started emerging really centered on women's economic contributions to their households and communities. And I thought, with our fantastic resources available at the Society, what could be easier than pulling together a comprehensive yet succinct presentation on the economic activities pursued by Exeter women from the colonial era through about yesterday? Well, it turns out a lot of things could be easier is the answer. So before I launch into the body of this presentation, I do want to offer a few caveats. First of all, the early part of this presentation is not as Exeter-centric as I might have hoped it would be, mostly because finding women's contributions in the historical record can be challenging, and it's more challenging the earlier or further back in history that you go. I had to cast a somewhat wider net around general New England history, with particular attention to New Hampshire and, of course, to Exeter, in order to round out that portion of the presentation. Second, when you're looking for evidence of what women are doing on a day-to-day basis, sometimes you have to fill in some gaps. Few of us breathlessly record every moment of what we do, mostly because we're busy doing it, and you have to imagine how perplexed you'd be if some future historian came back to your day and started following you around saying, "What are you doing now? And why are you doing that?" And you'd just be like, "I'm just shopping for groceries, go away." And I can imagine that they would be equally puzzled to know how interested we are in that. Finally, I want to be clear that the women that I've researched are mostly of white European descent, and there are many different and very relevant groups of women whose history I did not examine here. So this is a long-winded way of my saying these remarks are more of a kaleidoscopic impression on a theme than they are hard history, so please keep that in mind. In light of America's 250th, went too far. I wanted to make sure to include an early colonial and pre-revolutionary component to this talk. So when I started pulling this together, I decided to try to place Exeter in some historical context. And these are some things that helped me locate our founding sort of in the big picture. So at the founding of Exeter, William Shakespeare has only been dead for a little bit over 20 years. And James VII of Scotland and I of England has really just passed away. The Church of England is only 104 years old and is already undergoing theological challenges in the form of the Puritans, who began during the reign of Elizabeth I, and also from the Separatists, had left for Holland only one generation earlier. The first English Bible was a little over 100 years old, and even the Canterbury Tales had been printed only 162 years earlier. So, given that the town of Exeter has existed for 388 years, our 1600s colonial foremothers would be much more comfortable with Chaucer's Miller's Wife and Baker's Wife than they would be with who we are today. And we might think of America as being very new, but it's not all that new. So when I started my research, I assumed that men and women had completely different roles in the household, and that women's roles were
mostly domestic, and that assumption was challenged right off the bat. The other Exeter has its own great educational institution, and I found this wonderful article where the researchers looked at court depositions and coroner's reports to try to tease out the economic activity of the residents. And what really came out of that is that women are working. The labor needed to keep a family economically afloat was too demanding and too all-encompassing for women and men to inhabit completely separate spheres. Women's labor is not contained simply to family chores or raising a family. What we do know, so as you see, almost 40% of the work being done in agriculture, in transporting goods, in making food, women are involved in that in some way. So why don't we know more? You probably, if you're an amateur historian of any duration, you've probably heard of couverture, which is where women's activities are under the cover of and therefore subsumed in men's work. So in the historical record, it can be difficult to impossible to distinguish the work being done by a male head of household from work being done in the name of that male, because it would have all been lumped under his activity. So, we're going to start with the early colonial era. And as I was researching that, this great quote came up from David Freeman Hawke, which says, "Recent scholarship has shown that no generalization seems to hold up." So even as we're talking in generalizations, I want to make it clear that there could be individual differences depending upon a town you're researching, a situation you're researching, but I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview. So the various regions of the colonies had distinctly different settlement patterns, but in general, and again, generalizations don't seem to hold up, the New England colonies tended to be settled by families traveling in groups, as opposed to other regions where you had a greater imbalance of between males and females. Furthermore, New England family units were relatively stable, with women living closer to what we would consider to be a full lifespan, which means they have more opportunity to participate in economic activity. Even though New England was settled by family groups, the relative scarcity of labor in general made women's work much more valuable. The circumstances around women's labor in New England can be compared to England in the 1400s, prior to the creation of exclusively male craft guilds. When the craft guilds rise, they push women out of the workforce in the name of professionalizing what they're doing. You come over to the colonies, those craft guilds don't exist. Women's efforts, therefore, can be incorporated more fully. This map is actually from 1802, so I want to make it clear this is not pre-revolutionary or colonial, but it's an early map. And I like it because when we talk about the colonial era, historians often refer to what they call the quote-unquote family economy of the pre-industrial and early industrial world. And the quote is, "All occupations were centered in the home or a nearby office or workshop," end quote. So by necessity or choice, women often acted as proxies and deputies for their husbands. What I like about this slide, you can see as things are named, you may see things, the proximity, like we have Widow Folsom's Tavern just down the street from J. Folsom. So where you live and where you work are really intermingled. And in this family economy, women play a significant role in just sort of oiling the machinery, making sure things run along. In her book, Good Wives, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich quotes a letter Moses Gilman wrote to his wife Elizabeth sometime in the 1670s. He asks her to oversee the transaction of a sale of lumber to Thomas Woodbridge, writing, quote, "So order the matter that Mr. Thomas Woodbridge may have 12,000 feet of merchantable boards rafted by Thursday night or sooner if possible." This transaction is based on the assumption that Elizabeth can manage the logistics of making this transaction among several people and keep careful tabs on the proceedings. Without her assistance, Moses Gilman would not have been free to leave home long enough to travel to Boston, where he wrote this letter in this case. And of course, any discussion of colonial New Hampshire would be incomplete if we didn't talk about cows, right? In New Hampshire, cow keeping and dairying were seen as women's work, with calves, lambs, kids, butter, and cheese all produced for market. Although women were not specifically credited for this work, they were integral to the success of dairying. And Mr. Ambrose Gibbons wrote in August of 1634, he was managing Captain John Mason's plantation located in what's now Portsmouth, and he wrote, "A good husband with his wife to tend the cattle and to make butter and cheese will be profitable. For maids, they are soon gone in this country." Many farmers at that time combined their farming with a trade because, as the quote on the title slide for this section said, prosperity required input from both good husbands and good wives. And that's from a book called Increase and Vantage. Clearly, with men splitting their time between farm chores in the fields and wielding a trade, at the very least, the women in the household would have to be up to speed on their husband's activities, able to answer inquiries, pass along messages, or otherwise facilitate economic transactions. They acted as surrogates in their husband's absence. They often acted as their agents if if the husband is out in the fields and they go into town, they're acting as agents, etc. All right, which brings us to pre-revolution through the early republic. And remember, the Industrial Revolution, the first inklings of that come over when the American Revolution is also underway. Samuel Slater comes over, he brings his photographic memory of the English mills to Rhode Island, and we often think of the Industrial Revolution as being something that doesn't take place till much later, but it starts pretty early on. As we move into the early Industrial Revolution, what are women doing? There are some constants in this, and I've listed some of these. Through the remainder of this presentation, you're going to hear some of these kinds of pursuits multiple times. As we get into the 1700s, New Hampshire experiences a boom in the lumber industry and in woodworking. And as new opportunities related to these activities arise for men, they stop working on textiles. So textiles, especially weaving, becomes seen as women's work. This is different from other regions of the country. New England had a lot of female weavers. If you go to colonial Williamsburg, for example, I was shocked when I went there to see the big looms having men were apprenticing as weavers, and they said this was not a women's trade there at all, for example. Artisanal weavers were generally male. Flax, the fiber used to make linen, was a common farm crop throughout New England, and of course, we were raising sheep, and sheep's wool was a valuable commodity. These are objects that the American Independence Museum shared pictures with me. So women are responsible for producing all the basic linens needed in the household. This includes sheets, tablecloths, towels, as well as what you're wearing. A typical household needed items produced by knitting, weaving, and sewing, and relied on a combination of homemade and purchased material to fulfill the needs. The earliest mills in our area were often involved in some form of processing the raw materials for textiles, such as carding wool or combing flax, which would then be taken by women to be spun, woven, or knit into final form, either for their own use or for barter or for sale. The labor women perform with textiles also makes a critical financial contribution to many New England households. Again, we have to go a little further afield than New Hampshire to support this proposition, but one source of evidence is a notice in a June 1811 edition of the Vermont Journal, in which Hannah West publishes an advertisement accusing Thomas West of desertion, specifically identifying the economic impact of his actions. So at this time, in order not for, if you are a married couple and you've got some marital drama going on, if you don't want to be saddled with your former spouse's debts, you have to publish a notice of desertion, which kind of acts as a signal to your creditors, don't pester me, go after that person. In her notice of desertion, she claims, quote, "He carried away my flax, wool, and all the provisions which we raised on our farm the last year, which was enough to have supported our family had it been taken care of in a prudent manner." And notice the my flax, my wool, these were products that she identified herself with. So in addition to making products like soap, candles, and butter, women processed raw materials into intermediate goods, such as taking the flax and making it into thread, making wool into yarn, which then could be sold on as products in their own right, or used to produce textiles made of things such as linen or wool, something they called linsey woolsey, which was a linen and wool blend. There's some textiles woven from hemp, and to a very small extent, they're also weaving with cotton. It's really no coincidence that all of the artifacts the American Independence Museum shared with me that they consider related to women's history are basically items that have a connection to textiles. Even fancy needlework done by women of with sort of more financial resources, even the fancy work that they're doing for their own use, for their own enrichment or benefit, demonstrates just how central textile work was to women of this period, because women were expected to be very accomplished needle workers, even if it was solely for decorative purposes. So you are not an accomplished woman unless you can make these very elaborate kinds of bed hangings, and also some samplers, including my favorite sampler over here, which is not an Exeter or a New Hampshire artifact, but I just had to include it because you can make people try things, but you can't make them like them. If you notice at the bottom, it says, Patty Polk did this and she hated every stitch, 1837. She likes to read much more. And Patty, I'm with you, girl. Okay. So as I started looking into the 1800s, what also became evident is that when you're looking for women's history, you have to look differently. You might not find it in official record keeping, but it's there. One source I used to understand the early 1800s was Elizabeth Dow Leonard's short memoir of her childhood, titled A Few Reminiscences of My Exeter Life. In it, she mentions a number of different economic activities performed by women, but she doesn't present them as here's economic activity. It was here's just what women are involved with during their daily lives, and she happened to capture it. For example, in her recollection, she talks about how families in town often hired a young woman to help out with household chores. So there we have some domestic work. In her words, quote, "We used to import them from the rural districts," by which I assume she means Stratham, and they often earmarked their stipend of $1 a week to pay for some form of secondary education for themselves, perhaps with an eye toward becoming school teachers in the future. I have to admit, as an educator myself, Dow Leonard doesn't make education look like a very desirable career path. She describes the educators of her own youth as women who are down on their luck and don't have many other options. Her quote was, "Our teachers were all decayed sisters of gentility, and I don't know about you, but I don't care to be described as decaying." Call it a personal quirk. And that's ironic because Dow Leonard herself actually worked as a live-in tutor at one point, working for the family of Commodore Henley, offering lessons a few hours a day to his two daughters, whom she called her friends and companions. She does not tell us how much she was paid, although I assume she was paid something. The other work that she mentions, the other economic work, is in the person of a woman called Aunt Susie, who hired herself out, and Dow Leonard says, quote unquote, by necessity, but she doesn't say why. Aunt Susie was a combination housekeeper, babysitter, nurse. She would come to your house basically as needed. When she wasn't occupied with those tasks, Aunt Susie also offered her services as a confectioner, which means probably baking desserts in her own home. The other major economic activity Dow Leonard mentions is about dressmaking. Local dressmakers, she said, charged 50 cents a day to make a high-end dress. A house dress could be made in half a day for 25 cents. So household assistance, childcare, education, textile work, it's all there. So as we approach the mid-1800s, women's employment moves into the familiar territory of millwork, which is certainly very evident all around us here. And millwork employed large numbers of women locally. Starting with the mill girl years, which historians refer to 1820 to 1840. During that span of time, mill owners focused on hiring unmarried farm girls who would come in, work for however long they felt was productive for them, and then would move on. However, the demand for a consistent workforce that would accept reliably low wages meant that factories soon shifted their focus to immigrants, children, and families of little means, all right, for obvious reasons. Exeter is no exception to this rule. As factory work shifted from young native-born women to women with families, one question that arose is, how are these families being looked after? The farm girls are hired specifically because they're not burdened with family care, but as you start moving into immigrants and people who are local people in need of work, you're going to get families. In the southern U.S., there's a clear pattern that women factory workers are hiring black women to look after their children because the black women don't have the option of working in the factories. They are systematically prevented from taking those jobs. In the industrial UK, there's some evidence that mothers kept their children with them in the mills, at least in their children's younger years, even using a system of baskets placed in and around the machinery to keep the youngest children out of the way. Our best guess here in Exeter is that there was some kind of informal network of childcare with older children looking after their siblings, or perhaps a neighbor or older family member taking on child minding for pay or for lodging, something like that. This is probably hard to read from where you are, but this over here, the enumeration of children, this is kind of a census record that the schools kept saying, you know, who are these children, what school are they in, where are they going? And we have a female student in the upper left corner and a male student in the middle of the lower set of records. And you can see it says, if you can read it, it says they're not in school anymore. They took a census, and then a year later they take another census, and it says, no longer here, Exeter Manufacturing Company for both of them. So you can see that there are opportunities in the mills for both male and female workers. The young teenagers listed here probably turned over some or all of their wages to their families based on each individual family's calculus on what would benefit the family unit more. Is it better to have your older children going out and working for wages that you can then use to help pay for rent and necessities, or should they stay home and care for younger brothers or sisters? So it's the same thing, it's a different form of the same thing that working families go through today. Do I put my child in daycare? Do I work part-time? Do I take night work? It's the same kind of thing. So if you are a woman living in the 1800s in Exeter and you have to work, mill work is a potential avenue of employment. But not if you're from the middle class or have pretensions of being middle class. That narrows your options. The Exeter Directory, pictured here from 1872, gives us some sense of what the occupations local women are pursuing. They're milliners, they're instructors or teachers at Robinson Female Seminary, and I don't know if there's a specific distinction between those two or if it's a self-reported, this is what they call themselves. We have a lot of workers at the Exeter Manufacturing Company or boarding house keepers. So if you are, like you're a middle class family who owns your home and maybe a wage earner dies or something and you need to keep going financially, well, you can rent out some rooms in your house. In fact, during the 1800s, our very own Gilman Garrison House was a boarding house, which I did not know, and several generations of milliners kept shop there. Oh, look. We're not going to start again, don't worry. I won't make you listen to it twice. Okay. So my favorite miller was Asnath Harvey Darling, who bought the property herself in 1864 and specifically noted that she wanted to own it, quote, independent of her present or any future husbands. So there's a woman with a long-range outlook. And what you see here on the slide is a millinery display that was meant to mimic the kinds of fashions and whatnot that would have been on display in her millinery shop in the 1860s. All right. But there are other forms of economic activity involving women taking place in this time period, which I found by doing one of my favorite things when I have to study all things Exeter, which is going spelunking through the back issues of the Exeter newsletter and just seeing what I can find. And here's some tidbits that came up. I thought I was going to find want ads hiring women to do domestic work, and I did not find that, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But advertisements for jobs specifically for women or for which women were welcome to apply were few and far between. Okay, here we have a dressmaker's job that would definitely be held by a woman. We have a woman advertising her services at a school of music. We have an entertainer giving and I don't know if she's an amateur or if she's a professional. I could not find anything definitive about that. We have this interesting ad here for winter employment, and it's interesting in a couple ways. First of all, they are obviously taking advantage of the fact that we are still an agricultural economy, and so you're going to have people with downtime in the winter months, and that it is male or female agents wanted. So I would love to know what kind of miracle, it slices, it dices, it does everything product they're trying to sell, but it was clearly something that women would want as much as men. All right. The last notice is for an executrix sale. Probably the most frequent reference I found to women in economic activity in the newspapers I looked at. I just sort of post-hold, meaning I looked at several different time periods and just took a random sampling from each time period. I see women as executors of wills. All right. The public announcements had to be made when you are executing or probating a will, and the notices I turned up raised some really interesting questions. First of all, women are being appointed as executors fairly regularly. This seems to indicate that it's not unusual for women to conduct businesses with lawyers, banks, and other institutions. You have to go out and tie up all these loose ends when you're dealing with an estate. But in my admittedly entirely unscientific survey, I noticed that a lot of the estate notices with women executors mention that the estate isn't worth enough to settle the deceased's debts, and the executrix is selling up to pay off debtors. So that's an interesting distinction. Are women becoming executors because it's a family that doesn't have options, that that's the end of the generational line, or they just don't have enough money to have other options? I'm not sure. If you're looking for a PhD thesis topic in women's history, please feel free to take this on. I would love to know what you find out. And then as you're going through, these little beautiful little mysteries pop up from time to time. And here's an example of one. I had asked Barbara to send me some images I could use with my classes around the Industrial Revolution, and this is one of them, and we have absolutely no idea who this is. So here's a family sitting for a formal portrait, and they're being photographed by a woman photographer who's then being photographed by someone else. So very meta of them for the time. But this woman is clearly, she's either the photographer herself or the photographer's assistant and trusted to complete the portrait there. She certainly looks like she's the primary photographer, but we have no idea. And if that baby knows, he or she ain't telling. So, and by the way, they're really brave to sit that cat in their lap and make that cat, like I've never owned a cat who would do anything you expected them to do like that for that period of time. All right. So by the last decades of the 1800s, new inventions like the typewriter and telephone are opening up career pathways for women as stenographers, court reporters, switchboard operators, and the like. A town like Exeter with a well-developed financial district, a courthouse, and a healthy number of legal firms operating locally certainly had need for employees with these skills. And although these jobs emerge in the U.S. at the tail end of the 1800s, it looks as though those jobs get to Exeter around after the turn of the century. The Exeter Historical Society notes that the first Robinson Female Seminary graduate known to have enrolled in a secretarial course is recorded in 1911. And I certainly saw a lot of advertisements for secretarial schools and secretarial courses in the turn of the century Exeter newsletter. The Exeter Nurses Training School operates from 1906 to 1935, which is certainly a very exciting era in the history of medicine. And these new professions are an important line of discussion for sure, and I can't do it justice here, but I think it's critical to recognize how these new career pathways are opening up for women. The image shown here is a picture from Peter Smith's glass plate negatives collection that is housed at the Society. The only thing we know about it is that it's from a store that was photographed in 1903. I included it because there are 6 people posing in this picture who are clearly employees in the store. They're not customers. And 5 of the 6 are female. And this is the women's clothing department, so that makes sense. There are other pictures, probably of the same store, in the men's department, all male clerks. So, commerce is an area where women have some opportunities too. So one category of employment I had a hard time finding evidence for, ironically, was paid domestic work. Because it can be challenging to quantify the work women are doing for their own households, but it was hard for me to find evidence exactly of specific things to do with paid domestic service. Phyllis Palmer wrote a book called Domesticity and Dirt, Housewives and Domestic Servants in the United States, looking specifically at the years between 1920 and 1950. And women working in domestic service made up the largest category of working women in the U.S. from the 1920s until the 1950 U.S. Census. This category is very broad. It encompasses everyone from women who are working full-time as live-in or live-out staff for one household, to women who worked as what were known as dailies for a regular or ad hoc rotation of households, to somebody who stops in a couple hours a week to help out with your laundry or your childcare, whatever that is. I was curious to figure out how women in Exeter found out about these jobs. How do you get a job as a domestic? Where do you find these jobs? What kinds of jobs are they being hired for? And I thought the Exeter newsletter would have want ads, but there were not any want ads for that kind of help in the editions that I read. So I walked into the Society last Saturday to tie up some loose ends, those loose ends being finishing this talk before Tuesday night rolled around. And just in a frame, we were moving some stuff in one of the museum's rooms, and in a frame I saw this. And it was like, what on earth is this? This is the only ad I found asking for domestic help in the work that I did. It's from the 1920s or thereabouts. After we asked around, we did some snooping, and Dana W. Baker, the person referenced here, he's a man. He's a local insurance agent and realtor, and it appears that as part of his real estate agency, he ran an employment service as well. And so you could register for 50 cents. For $1, he would put out a flyer advertising, I have these people who are available to do this kind of work. And over here on this side, the last line at the bottom says, several places now open for competent girls for housework. So I imagine, and again, I'm filling in some gaps here, but I imagine, how are you finding domestic work? Word of mouth. You're walking past a notice board, you're talking to somebody in church, you're hearing that, oh, so-and-so has been asking around looking for help, and, friend of a friend kind of thing. I'm sure there's a lot of word of mouth and a lot of this kind of local networking going on to find those jobs. We have a few notable examples of Exeter women who participated in the flexible economy of domestic work. One of whom is Maud Richards, mother of Olive Tardif. Maud is in that lovely shiny car. Her husband was a traveling salesman whose income fluctuated to a greater or lesser degree. And in order to bolster his income, she performed a variety of domestic services. She ran a boarding house for academy students until the academy ended that practice. After that, she started baking cakes. You could get a birthday cake delivered to your student at the academy, and she took on other catering jobs for the community. And throughout all of this, she was a prodigious home seamstress. Next to the picture of her, you'll see an image from her sewing book from 1914. She kept records of the items she sewed using remnants from the Exeter Handkerchief Factory and the Exeter Manufacturing Company. And her work was amazing. I have to imagine that the look of pride on her face sitting behind the wheel of that automobile is due, at least in some part, to the fact that she knows her work contributed to having this lovely car. Another example of women in domestic work is Helen Tufts Krieger, fondly known to us in the society as Betty Tufts. Betty married comparatively later in life and then was widowed fairly early, which meant that she had to provide for herself for a great deal of her adulthood. Betty offered music lessons in her home to generations of Exeter youth, offering as many as 8 half-hour lessons in a day, which is a lot of chopsticks and heart and soul to have to listen to. So, as my grandmother would say, she's earned her star in her crown in heaven. She also took in mending on a regular basis. She made hand lotion, which she would give to friends or put in parish sales for fundraisers, but she also sold some of that locally. Betty rented out space in her garage during the winter season. We can all understand why you would want to rent a garage in the winter season, don't we? And she worked in the summer months at a local consignment store in Hampton, which helped supplement her income against those times of year when children weren't as available for lessons. She loved to drive, and in her later years, she often took her friends, many of whom may not have had cars or licenses of their own, out on rides and on excursions. In turn, they helped pay for gas or treated her to lunch. Except for the income from the music lessons, most of this activity isn't considered as steady income the way we think of it, but it all would have been absolutely necessary for her economic survival. The last element I'm going to talk about is, well, actually second to last, sorry, don't mean to get you all excited, is community care. And there might be a better name for this category of activity, but it was what I could come up with to try to encompass this. And what I mean by this is that it's the assistance women are rendering in their communities that today we would call or see as falling under the purview of the social service safety net. Until FDR's alphabet soup programs were created in the 30s, care of those unable to support themselves or to live independently was a local responsibility. And a lot of that work was borne by women. Going all the way back to those early 1800s, Elizabeth Dow Leonard refers frequently in her memoirs to the efforts her mother and other women of the town undertook to feed the poor. In her youth, the poorhouse still existed in Exeter. And Dow Leonard talks about how 2 of her mother's friends alternated providing meals for some of the more elderly residents of the poorhouse, but only for the better sort, according to her. The community care Dow Leonard records most thoroughly revolves around the Thanksgiving holiday. Why Thanksgiving? Because the Christmas holiday smacks far too much of popery, according to her. In her memoir, she said that at Thanksgiving, those living in poverty could request help in the form of, quote, flour, sugar, fowls, and money. And once again, only for the better class of poor, they could also request help in the form of pies. By her count, her mother would bake up to 70 pies to give away during the Thanksgiving season. And as someone who makes pies, I can tell you that 70 pies reflects a significant investment of time, labor, and expense. What it means to offer community care changes as the times change. The woman pictured here is Lucy Getchell. In the early 1900s through 1910s, she was president and procuring agent for the Exeter Hospital Guild. The Guild provided bedding and gowns for the entire hospital. This was a volunteer position which required coordinating with local textile manufacturers and businesses to provide materials, which Guild members then sewed into sheets, pillowcases, and hospital gowns. In today's world, Lucy Getchell might be a supply chain and materials management executive for a healthcare consortium. The work she's providing is absolutely integral to the service that the hospital is offering the community. There's another PhD thesis in there about the economic value various women's auxiliary groups bring to their local communities in the guise of doing good works, and again, I want some credit in your citation when you do that. And that brings me to this group of women I started thinking of as the outliers. I came across, in every era, I came across examples of women who built successful careers in fields that would not traditionally be considered as fields open to women. Dow Leonard makes reference to several women who were unusually accomplished for their day, several of whom are listed here. Most notably, Dow Leonard writes, "The court was open to ladies, and if the cases were interesting to us, we went in to judge for ourselves what sort of men sat in judgment upon us." Ariana, the daughter of Judge Smith, pursued a course of legal studies with her father, and many lawyers used to declare her opinion as reliable as his. Okay. And although that's a pattern that I found as I was going through this, again, my research wasn't exhaustive, but one thing I noticed is that a lot of these outliers are following in the footsteps of a father or working with a father in some way. The ad over on the side, although it's not Exeter, it was published in the Exeter newsletter, was of a history of Hampton, New Hampshire by Joseph Dow, but notice it says it's edited by his daughter. So that's a commercial endeavor that they're putting forth, and she is part of that process. Another example, one of Betty Tufts Krieger's great friends was Mary Brown, who ran the John A. Brown Insurance Company on Water Street after her mother had inherited it from her father. So again, the father institutes the business, but then the daughter follows along. The primary sources of the day tend to treat these women as these kind of amusing anomalies. Oh, look at this woman, look at her doing this unusual thing. But the fact that we can find a fairly extensive list of names for this slide indicates that some women are finding pathways into professions where we would not expect them to be. So, in conclusion, in the course of this research, I gained a new outlook on the saying, women's work is never done. It's clear that women's economic efforts are critical to meeting personal, familial, and community needs, even as women are raising families and participating in community life. The concept of a society in which one adult man's efforts could provide all the financial support necessary to support an extended family, while women only have to be concerned with domestic tasks, is not only very limiting, it's also not at all historically accurate. One thing I tell my students all the time is that history is like an onion. It has layers. And when we start peeling back the layers, we see the reality of how our foremothers and fathers lived often is very different from what we think it was. And we do ourselves a disservice if we don't seek out and acknowledge what truly happened. I really want to thank everybody at the Society who helped me and fielded my endless phone calls and texts. And I appreciate all of you who dared the elements to come out here tonight. And I'm very happy. I hope those of you at home enjoyed this too. And I want to thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much for a wonderful program. Do you have any idea what jobs the women did in the mills across the river or in the shoe and boot factories with regards to management or anything like that?
Oh, management not being on the floor. Barbara, you may need to help me out. Most management, overseers jobs and whatnot, those are mostly men. Women are doing the shop work, they're running sewing machines and the apparatus and so forth. Barbara, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I'd agree. I would say in the shoe shops, especially, the women were the stitchers. The men did a lot of the cutting and the heavier work, and the women were doing stitching and trimming and that type of work. At the mills, they were tending the looms, and there were other jobs that the men did. The men were in the dyeing and the bleaching sheds and such.
From some wonderful programs here, I know about the postcards that were colored by the women. Can you tell us more about them?
I really did not research into that. Barbara, I'm going to pass
Those are the Swallow postcards that were done by the Frank Swallow Company, and the women were hired to put the color on them. So rather than having lithographic equipment here, instead the women would sit and just paint every single card. And each woman had a different color, so one would be doing all the greens of the leaves on the trees, and the next person might be doing the red brick work, and that's how that worked. But yeah, they did that right here in Exeter.
I have a couple of comments, not questions, just praising the presentation, so thank you.
Did my dad tell me to slow down and look up?
One more question.
Do you have a favorite story that you found about a woman in work during your research?
Oh my gosh, it's so hard to pick just one. I had to cut this slide, but this slide kind of encompassed everything, because we've got women in corsetry, women in agriculture selling eggs, hooking rugs, raising things, and then we have this sort of terribly sexist, cartoon saying you get a bill of divorcement from wash day drudgery. That's what you're sure of when you send your laundry here. So, it really, there were so many little bits of things that I tried to weave in, but then we'd all be sitting here way longer than we already have been. So I had to leave them out. So thank you all so much. I really enjoyed pulling this together, and I'm glad for your very enthusiastic participation here tonight. And we'll see you next month at next month's program.
Thank you.